Welcome to the deep dive. Today we are strapping in for a really deep analysis of military transformation. We're looking at about a half century of change.
And it's change that didn't just alter technology, right? It fundamentally rewrote the rules of global power.
Exactly. And our guide for this journey is, well, the master strategist himself, Captain Alfred Thayer Mahan. We're using his memoir, From Sail to Steam, Recollections of Naval Life, as our main source.
Yeah, that memoir is just fantastic because Mahan wasn't just watching history unfold. He was right there, living through the exact moment the old world sort of died out.
You saw the whole thing?
The entire U.S. Navy transitioning from these wooden sailing ships to, steel behemoths driven by engines.
Yeah.
And he captures the sheer scale of it brilliantly. He even says the change was as dramatic as rebuilding San Francisco after the big earthquake.
Wow, that's quite a comparison.
It really sets the stage.
It does. It immediately frames the era for us, doesn't it? You have this world of almost comfortable obsolescence in the mid-19th century Navy.
Kind of coasting along.
Right. And then suddenly it's being dragged, kicking and screaming almost, into modernity. It wasn't a gentle shift.
No, not at all. It was a real institutional struggle, driven by technology, of course, but maybe even more by geopolitics.
That's a crucial point. Mahan pinpoints a huge external shock that really lit the fuse under military services everywhere.
He does. The establishment of the German Empire in 1870, that quick, decisive German win over France, sent out this powerful, organizing military impulse, as he calls it.
An impulse that just radiated outward.
Exactly. Mahan felt that event really braced and organized Western civilization, preparing it for an ordeal they couldn't quite see yet. It was a wake-up call.
Telling every major power that, well, isolation and just being institutionally sluggish wasn't going to cut it anymore.
Not an option. The future belonged to organized, disciplined force. That was the message.
So we're not just looking at, when they swapped out masts for funnels. We're digging into what happens when an entire military culture has to fundamentally change under pressure.
Yeah, and the mission for you, the listener, is to really extract the essence of that transition. We're talking about the institutional decay, the human side, the humor even.
Right, the clash between tradition and new ideas, the technology leaps.
And how all of that ultimately led to Mahan's own groundbreaking theory of sea power. It's quite a story.
Okay, let's start back before the Civil War. That decade, 1850 to 1860, Mahan paints a pretty bleak picture of the American institutional environment then.
He calls it an atmosphere of indifference to military affairs.
Indifference. That sounds bad.
Well, it was a kind of luxury the U.S. thought it could afford after the War of 1812. Distance from Europe, this deep confidence in just commercial progress.
The Navy was sort of neglected.
Essentially starved, yeah, of resources, of attention. It wasn't necessarily malicious neglect, but it was profound. It stopped the service from adapting, from innovating, from making necessary internal changes.
But, and this is important, he makes it clear this external neglect didn't mean the officers themselves were corrupt or lacked morale.
No, he's very careful about that. He praises their high sense of duty and of professional integrity. They kept their standards high internally.
So if the outside world wasn't giving them any recognition, where did their professional satisfaction come from? What kept them going?
It had to be internal. It was all focused on mastering their craft. The compensation, really, was this deep, almost personal connection to the ships.
He writes beautifully about that.
He does, calling the ships quick as a docile and intelligent animal to respond to the master's call. The real reward, the ultimate proof you were good, was la joie de la manœuvre, that deep satisfaction from skillfully handling the sails and spars.
So it was their way of saying, we're professionals, even if nobody notices.
Pretty much. That was their validation.
But that intense focus on the skill of sailing?
Yeah.
It seems like it might have blinded them to problems elsewhere, like in their personnel system.
Oh, absolutely. It masked a system that was, well, catastrophically flawed, doesn't even cover it. The minute an officer passed his initial exam to become lieutenant, that was basically it. He was untouchable. There was just no mechanism, no process at all for reviewing qualifications later on or assessing competence, or, crucially, removing people who became physically unable to serve.
Lifetime appointments, regardless of performance.
Essentially, yes. Regardless of performance or physical condition.
And the examples Mahan gives of this stagnation are just hard to believe today. They really show how tradition just overrode any kind of practicality.
They really do. Take the midshipman who lost a foot back in the War of 1812.
Right.
For 40 years, the Navy carried him, promoted him grade by grade, right up to captain, which was the highest rank then.
40 years. Why?
The logic, as Mahan saw it, was he was a brave kid back then, so we owe it to him to carry him forever. Sentimentality completely trumped operational need.
And it wasn't just about physical issues, right? There was no way to deal with professional incompetence either.
Exactly. Mahan personally knew an officer who was literally bedridden for almost 10 years.
10 years.
Yet he stayed on the active list, got promotions while completely unable to serve, and then you had these guys, the old diehards, perpetually stuck at the top of the lieutenant's list.
The ones who are always second in command.
Year after year, they kept getting overslot.
Overslot. What does that mean exactly?
It means they were passed over for promotion. Everyone knew they were either incompetent or just too old for command, but they were never actually kicked out.
So they just stayed there, taking up a spot, getting paid.
Yep. Career purgatory, basically. Poisoning the whole system from the top down.
Like institutional cholesterol, as you said earlier.
That's a good way to put it. And the examination system itself was powerless. Mahan tells this painful story about a young officer. His captain wrote flat out, "Nothing will make an officer of him."
Pretty clear warning.
You'd think, but the examination board passed him anyway.
Why? How could they ignore the captain?
Because the captain's letter wasn't part of the formal academic exam questions. Years later, Mahan was on a board facing the exact same situation. Another CO's letter was explicitly condemnatory and strong. The board president refused to consider it, said they couldn't go beyond the formal exam. Mahan later described that officer as having eccentric worthlessness. The system cared more about rigid process than actual competence.
Wow. Form over function completely.
Yep.
Which I guess leads us perfectly into the Civil War when they suddenly needed a flood of new, competent officers.
And you see the entitlement that old system bred. Mahan shares this amazing, almost comical story.
Oh, yeah.
So the Navy had to bring in volunteer officers, right?
Yeah.
And some were, let's say, less than professional. This one volunteer comes up for his promotion exam.
Okay.
The board asks him the most basic seamanship questions, like the difference between a ship moored and one at single anchor. Simple stuff. He fails every single one.
Oh, dear.
The board is totally baffled. They ask him, look, if you know nothing, why did you even apply for the examination?
And what did he say?
He says with total confidence, I did not apply for examination. I applied for promotion.
Unbelievable.
Isn't it? He just saw a rank as something you get, not something you earn through skill. That one line just sums up the whole entitled, complacent attitude Mahan was fighting.
And that mindset, that complacency, it wasn't just in the people. It was reflected in the ships they were sailing too, right? Which brings us to the big technological drama, the switch to steam.
Yeah, the uneasy, often really reluctant embrace of steam power. The first attempts back in the 1840s were almost funny from a military perspective. These paddle wheel steam warships.
They worked right. They moved without wind.
They moved, sure, but they had a massive tactical flaw, a fatal one, really.
Which was?
Think about those big paddle wheels on the sides, the shaft connecting them, a lot of the engine machinery. It had to be exposed above the waterline.
Ah, so vulnerable in a fight.
Extremely vulnerable. One good shot hits that exposed machinery, and the whole ship is dead in the water. Mahan said it was probably more fatal than damage to sails, because with sails you had redundancy. You could maybe fix them or limp away. Engine shattered. You're done.
And the U.S. Navy had some prominent examples of this problem.
They did. The sister ships, Missouri and Mississippi, big, expensive paddle wheelers. The Missouri burned up in 1843. The Mississippi had the same fate 20 years later, in 63, trying to get past Port Hudson with Farragut.
So the vulnerability was obvious.
Very obvious. Anyone who saw them in action knew those exposed wheels were a huge liability.
Which means the real revolution, for warships anyway, only came with the screw propeller.
The screw propeller absolutely changed the game because it solved that core vulnerability problem. It's elegant, really.
How so?
The propeller is entirely underwater, so all the vital heavy machinery, the engine, boilers, the drive shaft, could finally be placed deep inside the hull, protected by the ship's structure, protected by the water itself.
Okay, that makes sense. That's when steam really became viable for combat.
That was the moment.
But even with that clear advantage, the Navy was still super hesitant. Steam was only seen as an accessory, Mahan says, for emergencies. Why so much resistance then? Was it just old habits?
There are practical reasons too, definitely. Cost was a big one. Coal was incredibly expensive compared to free wind. Running engines constantly burned through fuel at an enormous rate.
Right. Mahan points out that sails are expensive too, needing constant upkeep.
Very expensive articles, yeah. Lots of skilled labor needed for sails and rigging, but still, he says, they were less costly than coal.
And there was another issue, structural.
Yeah, the old wooden hulls just weren't really built to handle the stress and vibration of powerful engines. They lacked rigidity. It caused a lot of extra wear and tear.
So practical hurdles, but also that deep-seated resistance to change, that professional prepossession, as Mahan calls it.
Oh, absolutely. You get great anecdotes from that. Like the ship's sailmaker Mahan knew. Smart guy, brave guy, but he just couldn't accept that steam would take over.
What was his theory?
He argued sailing fleets would always be the main thing. Steamers, they'd just be little support vessels, tugs, essentially, to tow becalmed sailing ships or pull damaged ones out of the line of battle.
Huh. Seeing the future entirely through the lens of the past. Steam serving sail.
Perfectly encapsulates that bias. He couldn't imagine the sail becoming secondary.
And that kind of thinking led to those weird transitional ships, right? The auxiliary steam warships.
Yeah, they were fascinating hybrids, really sailors first, but with engines sort of crammed in.
What'd they look like?
They were visually very impressive. Think of the big British ones like the 90-gun Rodney or the Princess Royal. Huge ships, double or triple rows of gun ports along those broad white bands on the Black Hull.
Towering masts.
Absolutely. All the visual language of sailing dominance built up over centuries, they looked powerful.
But there was always that one giveaway. The smokestack?
The telescopic funnel. That was the compromise, the visual symbol of their internal conflict.
Telescopic. So it could retract.
Exactly. It could be lowered down almost out of sight when the ship was under sail, like they were trying to hide the evidence of the engine.
Almost like institutional denial. Yes, we have this engine, but look, we're still a proper sailing ship.
Functionally modernizing, but desperately clinging to the image of the past. That was the auxiliary era in a nutshell. And this whole tech transition, it was happening within a very specific American naval philosophy, one that was, well, ultimately quite limiting, and Mahan would later spend his whole career trying to change it.
Right, that traditional philosophy was all about isolated cruisers, wasn't it? Not fleets working together. The goal was always individual ship superiority.
Mahan points out that even the dozen big ships of the line the U.S. built back in the sailing era, they never sailed together. They were powerful on their own, but to no line belonged.
The tradition was basically, if we build a frigate, it has to be stronger and faster than any other country's frigate.
Exactly. Like the famous frigates from the War of 1812, they were practically ships of the line in disguise. Always punching above their weight class, relying on superior individual force.
Which sounds good, right? Who wouldn't want stronger ships? But what was the strategic problem with that approach? Why did Mahan criticize it?
Because war, especially naval war for control of the sea, isn't usually won by individual duels. It's won by strategic control, by fleet action. Look at Great Britain.
Their approach was different.
Completely. They focused on building homogeneous fleets. Lots of ships of the same class that could maneuver together smoothly, respond to signals identically, fight as a coordinated unit. Tactical facility and combined action were prioritized over making each individual ship the absolute biggest or strongest.
So the British valued the fleet, the Americans valued the single super ship.
And that's a good summary. The American way was great for raiding enemy commerce or winning famous one-on-one fights, but it wasn't geared towards the big, decisive fleet battles that actually determine who controls the oceans.
Yet that very philosophy drove the biggest shipbuilding push right before the Civil War, those 6 huge screw frigates in the mid-1850s, ships like the Wabash in Colorado.
Right. Those were built with a specific potential enemy in mind, probably Britain or France. They were designed to be a powerful line of battle if they ever did get combined. Hugely expensive, heavily armed. The peak of that American super ship idea just now with steam power added.
And then comes the Civil War. And the great irony.
The great paradox, yeah. These incredibly powerful, cutting-edge frigates were, as Mahan put it, unfitted to the particular emergency of a civil contest.
Why? What was wrong with them?
They were useless for the main job the Union Navy suddenly had, blockading the South.
Ah, the blockade.
Exactly. These big frigates drew too much water. Their deep draft meant they couldn't get into the shallow harbors, the estuaries, the river mouths where the blockade runners operated. Mahan tells about the huge effort they spent trying to just drag the Colorado over the sandbar at the Mississippi Delta. Couldn't be done. She was too deep.
So they built the perfect ships for a big ocean battle that never came.
And ships that were totally wrong for the war they actually had to fight.
That seems like a major strategic blunder. But Mahan actually uses this failure to make a point about readiness, doesn't he?
He does. It's a subtle but important point. He argues that the early successes the Union did have Farragut pushing up the Mississippi, taking Port Royal, depended heavily on the ships and officers who were already available and ready to go when the war started.
Not the big new frigates, but other ships.
Smaller, more versatile ships. He specifically mentions the Hartford-class sloops of war. They'd been launched just before the war became inevitable. His point is, if the Navy hadn't been doing any building, hadn't had those slightly smaller, shallower draft steam vessels ready, the start of the war could have been a disaster.
Okay, I see. So even though the specific ships built for the expected war, the big frigates, were wrong for the actual war.
The very act of building them, maintaining a navy, training crews, having some modern steam vessels available, that underlying readiness was the crucial strategic asset. It allowed the Union to adapt and succeed early on.
That's a compelling argument. Preparedness pays off, even if the conflict isn't exactly what you prepared for. Okay, let's shift from the ships themselves to the sailors and officers. Mahan's time at the Naval Academy sounds like it was interesting. A real clash between academics and the old practical way of doing things.
Oh, yeah. It was a fascinating microcosm of the larger Navy split. Mahan really respected some of the academics, like Professor Chauvenet, brilliant mathematician.
But Chauvenet wasn't a fan of the practical guys.
Held them in utter contempt, apparently. Mahan tells this story Chauvenet used to illustrate his point. There was this other instructor, a surveyor, the midshipman, called Bullpup.
Bullpup.
Apparently, Bullpup was constantly breaking the delicate, expensive surveying instruments, the theodolites, just by cranking down too hard on the adjusting screws. Brute force instead of finesse. Chauvenet used it as proof that practical often just meant clumsy or ignorant.
A perfect little anecdote. So you have that side, scorn for the purely practical, but then you have the other extreme too.
Absolutely. The hyper-theoretical faction. Mahan talks about the professor of applied mathematics who insisted, totally seriously, that every deck officer needed to be able to calculate the power of a block and tackle system, a purchase, using calculus.
Wait, calculus? For figuring out pulleys and ropes?
Yeah. A purchase is just that system sailors used to lift heavy things like anchors or spars. For centuries, they'd used basic math, rules of thumb. It needed to be fast, practical, on deck, in the moment.
Suggesting they stop everything to do calculus seems absurd.
Utterly ridiculous. Mahan pointed out that naval history had gotten along just fine without deck officers doing infinitesimal calculations in the middle of hoisting a sail. It just showed how disconnected the classroom could be from the reality of the quarterdeck.
Let's move to that reality then. Life at sea. Mahan's cruise on the frigate Congress from 1859 to 61 sounds like a classic experience of the old sailing navy.
It really was. The Congress was big, but she was a terrible sailor. Slow, inefficient.
How slow?
Took them 67 days to get from Delaware to Bahia in Brazil. That's only about 4,000 miles. And that trip included getting stuck in the infamous horse latitudes.
Ah, the doldrums. No wind. Why horse latitudes, though?
The story goes that ships carrying horses across the Atlantic would get trapped in these calm zones for so long.
That they ran out of water.
Exactly. Ran low on water, and to conserve what little they had for the crew, they often had to throw the horses overboard. Grim stuff.
And Mahan experienced that kind of becalming, tedium and rationing.
Weeks of it, imagine. The ship just rolling sickeningly on the swells, no wind at all, so the sails just slap, slap, slap against the masts constantly. Maddening.
And water was tight.
Cut down to 2 quarts per man, per day, for everything. Drinking, washing, cooking. Just miserable. He contrasts that with the incredible relief when they finally hit the steady trade winds.
What was that like?
Suddenly, perfect silence, except for the sound of the wind humming in the rigging. And for the crew, it meant they could finally get a full due sleep, a proper night's rest, because they knew the wind wouldn't suddenly shift and force them all on deck to handle the yards. Pure physical relief.
These long voyages must have bred a very particular kind of skill, too. Not textbook stuff, but subtle seamanship, almost cunning.
Definitely. Mahan's jib sheet story is the perfect example of that.
Tell us that one.
He remembers this one officer. During his watch on deck, the ship always seemed to sail just a little bit faster than under the other officers.
How do you manage that?
Very subtly. He never gave a direct order that would get logged. But during muster, he'd just quietly murmur to the petty officer in charge of the forecastle, just slack off a little of this jib sheet.
Okay, so loosening the headsail slightly.
Right. Letting it balloon out just a tiny bit more, catch a fraction more wind. Then, just before his watch ended and he was relieved, he'd give another quiet nod to pull the sheet well flattened in again, back to the standard setting.
Huh. So he boosted performance just enough to look good without actually breaking any rules or drawing attention. Pure gamesmanship.
Exactly. The kind of subtle edge that marked a really sharp sailor. But it wasn't all calm or competition. He also captures the sheer terror of sudden danger, like hitting a Pampero gale off South America.
Pampero. Sounds fierce.
They are known for incredibly sudden, violent wind shifts. Mahan describes the wind hitting with a roar and a rush, butt end foremost. Huge drops of rain would skitter across the deck just before it hit. Instant blackness, visibility gone. And in that chaos, the captain had to shout the commands to save the ship. The critical maneuver was called boxing her off.
Boxing her off? What's that involve?
Because the wind hits so hard and suddenly from a new direction, you have to instantly swing the front sail, the foretop sail around to catch that blast and use it to push the ship's bow away from the wind briefly. It stops the ship from being knocked flat or overwhelmed. It has to be done incredibly fast, under immense pressure.
High stakes.
Yeah.
And did the captain manage it? What did the crew think?
Mahan overheard the boatswain's mate afterwards giving the ultimate compliment in that grudging sailor way. He said, "Now that's a clever old man." Boxing her off that way with all that wind and blackness was handsomely done.
High praise indeed from an old salt.
The highest.
The personalities really bring this world to life, too. The bosun sounds like quite a character.
Oh, he had some great lines. Describing the elderly, probably ineffective first lieutenant, he said the lieutenant was like an old piece of soap half wore out. Go day, come day, God send Sunday. That's you.
Ouch. Brutal assessment, poetically put.
Total contempt for stagnation, right? And then there's that lovely, simple story of the old forecastle hand, the captain of the main pop. He asked the ship's chaplain for a copy of the Life of Paul Jones, the famous Revolutionary War captain. Why? Because he claimed he used to be shipmates with him.
Shipmates? Paul Jones died decades before this guy was sailing.
Exactly. But when pressed, the old sailor clarified he'd served in the main top with Paul Jones, just some other ordinary sailor who happened to share the name and the duty station high up on the mast.
His world, his history, was shrunk down to the people he knew on that specific ship in that specific spot.
It's charming, isn't it? But that brings us back to the military temperament. That rigid Navy mindset clashed really badly with the civilians they had to bring in during the war.
Right, the volunteer officers and engineers.
Mahan saw it directly when he served on the James Adger, which was a purchased merchant steamer. He had to stop 2 of the engineers from just wandering off ashore without permission.
And how did that go down?
The chief engineer, who'd been on a ship when it was a civilian packet boat, came storming up to Mahan, flaming eyes and angry voice, basically saying the engine room ran itself. Mahan had no authority there.
Uh-oh. How did Mahan handle that?
Calmly, but firmly. He had to explain to the chief engineer that, unlike in the merchant service, on a warship, the engine room was but a department of the military whole of the ship. It wasn't independent.
A necessary lesson in hierarchy.
Absolutely. That little blow-up perfectly showed the difference between the Navy's unified command structure and the more independent, perhaps entitled attitude they encountered from some of the civilian intake. Everyone had to learn their place in the military system. So you take all these experiences together, the institutional rot, the shock of new technology, the sudden need for readiness, the practical lessons of command.
They all feed into Mahan's big intellectual moment later on.
They form the foundation, absolutely. And that breakthrough, it wasn't just internal. It was really kicked off by that huge geopolitical event we talked about earlier.
The Franco-Prussian War in 1870.
Right. Seeing the brand new German Empire just crush France so quickly, so decisively. It changed how everyone thought about military power. Mahan saw Napoleon III's fall as the start of a new era, a reign of organized and disciplined force. Complacency was deadly.
Okay, so fast forward about 15 years, 1885. Mahan gets assigned to the new Naval War College. He wasn't keen, was he?
Not at all. He was skeptical, and so were many of his peers. He quotes an older officer telling him, basically, don't bother with history, there's nothing useful there.
Because the technology had changed so much.
Exactly. Mahan himself initially thought naval history was wholly past, just stories about sailing ships, irrelevant now that they had engines. What could Nelson teach a steamship captain? That was the thinking.
But then came the light bulb moment, the real aha. And it happened in a pretty unlikely place.
Yeah, this is the fascinating part. He's reading Mommsen's History of Rome. Not naval history, Roman history. And he's doing it in the English Club in Callao, Peru, miles from any major naval power.
What part of Roman history sparked it?
The Second Punic War. Hannibal. And suddenly it hits him, like a bolt of lightning, he says. How different would history have been if Hannibal, after all his amazing victories on land in Italy—
If he could have been resupplied from Carthage.
Exactly. If he could have maintained free communication with Carthage by water. Rome controlled the sea. Carthage couldn't reinforce or resupply Hannibal effectively. His land brilliance was ultimately strangled by Rome's sea power.
Wow. So seeing that ancient example, why did that unlock modern naval strategy for him?
Because it showed him that control of the sea lanes, the ability to move your own stuff and stop the enemy moving theirs, was this huge, often invisible strategic factor. It wasn't just about the fighting. It was about logistics, communication, national power projection.
And nobody had really systemically studied that aspect before.
That was his core realization, that control of the sea was an historic factor which had never been systematically appreciated and expounded. People wrote about battles, sure, but not about the strategic consequences of who controlled the water.
Okay, so that's the central idea. How did he go about building his theory from that? What was his method?
Interestingly, he decided not to do lots of original archival research. He didn't see himself as a traditional historian digging for new facts.
More of a synthesizer.
Yes, a military philosopher. He took existing historical accounts and re-examined them through a strategic lens. He heavily relied on the principles of military strategy laid out by Antoine-Henri Jomini, the theorist of Napoleonic land warfare.
And applied Jomini's ideas about land campaigns to naval history.
Precisely. He was looking for the underlying principles of strategy, whether on land or sea.
And this was a big shift from how naval history was usually treated.
Huge shift. The old way, Mahan felt, just glorified downright hard fighting, punishing, and being punished. It was all about tactical heroism, the drama of the battle itself.
But Mahan framed war differently, as business.
Exactly. A colder, more analytical view. Naval battles weren't ends in themselves. They were means to achieving strategic objectives. His goal wasn't just to tell officers how to fight, but why they were fighting, what the larger purpose was.
And that strategic viewpoint led him to emphasize one of Jomini's key ideas about the main objective in war.
Right, the Jomini dictum, the primary target, the chief objective, must always be the enemy's organized military forces.
Not their trade routes or coastal towns.
No, that was a direct challenge to the popular American tradition of commerce raiding, or hitting ulterior objects, as Mahan called them, the softer targets. Mahan argued that stuff was secondary. You only gain true command of the sea by engaging and defeating the enemy's main fleet. Everything else is a distraction until you do that.
Okay, so all this thinking, this synthesis, culminates in his big book, The Influence of Sea Power Upon History, published in 1890. What was the reaction?
Internationally, it was an absolute bombshell, huge sensation, translated almost immediately into German, French, Japanese, Russian.
Why such a big impact abroad?
Well, for Great Britain, the world's dominant sea power, it basically provided the intellectual justification for what they were already doing instinctively. It gave them a coherent theory. And for rising powers like Germany and Japan, it was practically a blueprint for building a modern navy and asserting global influence. It fueled the naval arms race.
But what about back home, in the U.S. Navy? After all that work, was he finally accepted?
Not quite so much. While some officers got it, many didn't. Mahan himself recounts the classic, infamous line from a senior bureau chief back in Washington.
What did he say?
"It is not the business of a naval officer to write books."
Oh, wow. Even as other countries were reshaping their navies based on his ideas.
Yep. Large parts of his own service still saw his work as, some irrelevant academic exercise, not the roadmap to future global power that it actually was. Incredible, really.
So when we pull it all together, Mahan's whole journey, from that stagnant sailing navy to becoming this world-changing theorist, what's the big takeaway about nations and destiny?
For Mahan, it cemented his belief that American isolationism was over. It just wasn't sustainable anymore. Having seen firsthand the weakness caused by that atmosphere of indifference. He became a strong advocate for American engagement on the world stage.
Not necessarily imperialism like conquering territory, but
More like strategic responsibility, taking an active role. He believed the old policy of staying out of global affairs, which maybe worked in the early days, was totally outlived by the realities of the modern interconnected world.
so survival isn't about sticking to tradition. It's about constantly adapting to these external pressures.
That's exactly it. Mahan deeply believed the world proceeds through the pressure of circumstances, not just based on what a nation wants or feels comfortable with. And he had this crucial warning
Which was?
that failing to act when circumstances demand action may be as injurious as mistaken action. Inaction can be just as damaging as doing the wrong thing. He used this metaphor of the body decaying when the spirit, the will to engage and adapt, leaves it.
He saw that the shift from sail to steam wasn't just about technology.
It was a symptom of a much deeper shift towards organized, globalized power dynamics. The ships change, the weapons change, the systems change. But the fundamental need for clear strategic thinking, for foresight, that remains constant.
And that foresight, it's hard. Mahan himself admitted predicting the future is tough.
He was very humble about it. He knew it was difficult. But he left us with this really provocative thought, and it applies just as much today as it did then. He said, "It is all a matter of guess, but the world attributes wisdom to him who guesses right."
So the ultimate lesson from Mahan's life, maybe, is that strategic success isn't just about having the best ships or the bravest sailors.
Or even just reacting well.
Right. It's about making the best guess, the wisest guess, about where those global pressures are going to come from next and being ready for it. And that, perhaps, you, the listener, is the timeless challenge for any nation, any leader. Thank you for joining us for this deep dive.